Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Improving's virtual Lunch and Learn. Before we start, I want to call out the question feature in Teams, which will make the session a little more interactive. So please make note of the question mark icon in the upper right of the presentation screen. Clicking that icon will open the question and answer feature, which allows you to send in questions, which I will deliver to our presenter sort of at appropriate times throughout the presentation. With that said, we are excited to present Glenn Gordon, a senior consultant within Improving, who will be sharing, are you a technical agilist or an agile technologist? Over to you, Glenn.
Great, thanks, and welcome everybody who's tuning in today. This is going to be a fun session. There's a lot of concepts, so feel free to chime in with those questions and comments anytime that you like. So who am I? So I am a senior consultant with Improving. I've been here about 7 years. I hold certifications as a professional Scrum Master, professional Scrum product owner. I'm also pretty well versed in development and architecture. I've been doing that for about 20 years. I've also spent some time as a software trainer and was a technology evangelist for a good bit of my career as well. I really have a passion for both teams and technology. So it's sort of a foot in both worlds, which was sort of the inspiration for this talk. I've put my LinkedIn link here as well. So feel free to find me there and connect with me. So as I mentioned, why this talk, right? So one of the things that I've experienced in my career is the concept of folks that have come to sort of a pinnacle of two areas. One in the technical space, right? They're very good technologists. They're very comfortable with application development or database or infrastructure, that sort of thing. And also folks that are very sharp in the agile space. And so what I've come to realize is that when people get to this area where they've got skills in both sides, everybody's got a different backstory, right? They've come up through different circles. They've experienced the world differently. They've processed things differently. And so we know that this gives people different tools that they fall back on. If you are primarily from the agile space, the way that you're going to respond to things is based on that knowledge and experience. And if you're from the technical side, the way that you respond to the world, that's going to be from your background on that side as well. Folks have a different lens. Everybody has a different lens, the way they view and perceive things that they are experiencing, both in collaboration, in problem solving, in developing their own skills, in learning about their peers and their friends. People have these different lenses that were formed through their experience over the years. And it turns out that folks who have these tools that they've cultivated along their career, and they have these lenses that they've formed as they were working through their careers. You look at things differently in Agile. You look at the way Scrum works. You look at the way that the Agile Manifesto was put together and what some of the terms in there mean to you. And again, it's slightly different based on everybody's individual experience. And I also felt it was important not only to understand where you come from as an individual, but also how important it is to realize that other people are on different paths. Their way of looking at the world is going to be different because their lenses are different. The way that they respond to things are going to be different because their tool sets are different as well. So just to give you some more insight into my journey based on that previous slide, I started out as a coder. I was writing things in Foxborough and DBase many years ago. I spent a good bit of my career in Visual Studio, worked in that. I was a coder. Then I began training classes. I've had a real interest in sharing the knowledge that I had gathered over the years. And I found it very interesting to stand up in front of a classroom of folks and, train them and then hear their stories from the companies that they come from. I worked quite a bit in architecture and kind of expanded that. And it wasn't until maybe about, 8 or 9 years ago that I started really getting interested in the process itself and really growing an understanding of DevOps and Agile methodologies and things from there. And then I expanded quite a bit into Scrum, and I've been learning about that for the last 6 to 8 years. So that is my journey. Everybody's got their own journey. And as we go through the next 45 minutes to an hour, it's probably going to be valuable to sort of reflect back on that in the context of what we're going to be sharing here today. So let me give you a little parallel story to things we're going to cover later on today. So let's talk about these two coaches. So let's consider for a moment, someone will call her Mary, right? So Mary, perhaps, maybe she grew up playing soccer. She knows the strategies and techniques. She can teach other people how to play. She can put people through drills, and she can, really give them advice in some of the areas that they're lacking and they need to build their strengths, right? She is passionate, she's encouraging, she's invested in the outcome and the success of the people that she coaches. But maybe Mary has never worked with young kids at any developmental level, but yet she's still interested in maybe coaching a kid's soccer team. So let's put Mary aside for a moment and let's talk about George. So maybe George came up through, was a child educator. He's got a master's degree in this. Maybe he was a teacher before. He's worked with kids in a lot of stages of development. George is familiar with soccer, but hasn't done any coaching, hasn't run drills, hasn't had sort of the opportunity to observe somebody's skills and the rate at which their skills improve over time and what things would work for them. But George happens to be very compassionate and understanding and empathetic. But George has never coached a team, right? George doesn't know how to advise folks and kind of observe them and see, oh, they need to work on their footwork or learn to pass a little bit more, that sort of thing. That he didn't really get to see a tolerance for, how well people take advice in some of the coaching aspects. So let's talk about a convergence of these two coaches. This is Mary and George coming together to coach a team, right? So how do they interact with the kids on the team? Maybe they see a kid who's struggling to learn how to pass the ball, or they're getting a lot of goals scored on them or something like that. And depending on their lens that they're viewing these kids through, Mary or George, and their tools to sort of respond to that, Mary might see a need for more drills. You need to work on skills a little bit more, because if you were better at passing, it might be less frustrating to you. George, on the other hand, might say, did they eat lunch? Maybe they missed lunch. Maybe they need a snack, right? So coming at those two things, the way the kids, with George and Mary interact with the kids on the team is just their different lenses, right? The way they're processing, the way they're understanding what the kids are doing, what's behind those behaviors, what's behind those emotions, right? And then the tools that each coach, Mary or George, has is going to change how they respond. George might say, it's time for a break. Mary might say, it's time for some more drills, right? And then also, as these coaches are working together with the kids, they could be watching each other. And, maybe George is frustrated at Mary because Mary is not giving them the break that he feels that the kids need. And maybe Mary is a little frustrated with George because George isn't, working on the drills as much and giving them the right advice. And so these two coaches have kind of come to the same place of they're coaching a kid's soccer team, but their lenses are different and the way that they respond is different. Now, it's important to call out that we're not really talking about caricatures. I mean, you could sort of envision these as characters in a movie, and one, is really tough on the kids, and the other one is really gentle on the kids. But the truth of the matter is, this is a continuum. This is various places on the spectrum of compassion, high and low, ability to coach, high and low. So is not anything that is an abstract thing. This is real people who might have these sort of interactions, right? So if we extend that model a little bit, we might consider somebody who I would call, in preparing for this talk, an Agile Technologist, right? And this would be someone who came up through a technical background. They're sort of a technologist at heart. Maybe they're a coder, maybe they're an architect, maybe they're a tester, but they're very familiar with a lot of technical concepts. If you come at them with a problem that involves, connecting to microservices or setting up a SQL cluster or something like that and talking about transactions, They may not know the specifics of those individual things, but they're pretty comfortable with the concepts and can extrapolate beyond what they've done in the past and really absorb the new information that's coming their way. And they're comfortable dealing with things in a technical way. And they maybe became familiar with Agile secondarily. So I will say this is me. Having been through lots of work and lots of projects where I was writing code and writing unit tests and debugging and putting together deployments and things like that. This is definitely me. I became familiar with Agile and really gravitated towards it because it appealed to an aspect of my personality that is more than just heads down on the keyboard and stuff. So that was something that I moved to pretty naturally. On the other hand, you might have a technical Agilist. You might have somebody who came to the Agile space. Maybe they were a project manager. Maybe they were a business analyst. Maybe they worked with people, right? Maybe they were involved in a lot of business. Maybe they were an entrepreneur, right? So they started a new business, or they were involved in mergers and acquisitions and that sort of thing. They became familiar with technology by being involved in software projects, right? And maybe there's aspects of the technology that appealed to them. So they sort of said, oh, I can understand some of these things, and didn't necessarily find themselves working as developers or working as architects, but they have an appreciation for the technology. And it was just actually a couple of days ago, I ran across an article on LinkedIn from a colleague of mine, Emily Stickle, who's awesome. She works for Improving. And she wrote an article about referring to herself as being non-technical, even though she has been working for a technology company and has a lot of experience in the technical side, but had been in interactions where folks had said, well, you just asked me a question about a deployment or a security patch or something, and if you were more technical, you would have, you'd know that already. And I don't think that's particularly fair because, again, folks who come up through these different areas get familiar with the other side, but they don't have all the knowledge of it. They just sort of have an idea of how it's going to resonate with them and how it's incorporated into the core that they've already formed. So the key here is not to find yourself and beat yourself up for not being more of the other side than is your core, but just sort of pay attention to it and grow it and look for opportunities to say, you know what, I really am better with Agile than I think I am. I am better with technology than I think I am. So the point here is one is not better than the other. So in light of those two paths, let me throw out just a sentence that describes a problem you might have to solve in your day-to-day job, right? So let's say on your team, somebody has said, hey, you know what? We want to set up Azure DevOps to enable reporting on how code coverage tools and Sonar Cloud correlate to user stories. So for your individual journey of where you've come to Agile, what do you start thinking about when you see a sentence like this? As a technologist, my brain starts to go with, how am I going to integrate these things? Is this an API call? Do they have to authenticate against each other? How am I going to get that data and correlate it together, right? Somebody who is a technical Agilist will probably start thinking about the impact that this kind of thing might make to the team. Ooh, should we really be doing this sort of thing? Does it perhaps give the negative connotation that there is this expectation of, your code has to be perfect all the time, even when you have work that's in flight? How will this affect the trust of the team? You might even look at a sentence like this and say, oh, the technical wording is incorrect, or the approach to trying to implement something like this with a team is incorrect. So what I'm just using here is this is an illustration of what your default tools are. Obviously, you're going to probably think of the other side as well, but it may not be your visceral or your sort of out of the gate response. So giving this sort of background that people come at Agile and technology from two different directions, it can also shade and affect how people look at Agile concepts and sort of internalize them and respond to them. The concepts and the ideas, you may perceive them differently, right? When you're looking at things like what is a daily Scrum, what is a sprint, right? When we talk about technical debt, or we might talk about things like, planning for releases, potentially releasable software. What does that actually mean, potentially releasable? And the way that you view that and the way that you respond to that is going to be different based on where you come from. Semantics can be different, right? When you hear about a definition of done, right? Are you thinking of that in the perspective of, yeah, all my code is checked in and all my tests have passed, right? Are you looking at it from, the team has communicated and collaborated and covered everything they need to for this user story to get it to the point of being done? And then you may employ different tools in how you process and respond. You may start sitting down and looking at some analytical aspects of it. You may start looking at the team dynamics of things. And again, those tools are sort of your default tools based on where you came from. So one of the things we might look at from these two different perspectives with these two different lenses and two different tool sets is something like the Agile Manifesto. Now, hopefully you're familiar with this. These are clearly not my words, but this is something foundational to Agile. It was put together about 20 years ago. There was a group that gathered that was very familiar with a lot of concepts like extreme programming and Scrum, feature-driven design, pragmatic programming, and things like that. And they found themselves needing to come up with this concept as an alternative to really heavyweight software development that was all documentation driven and was really resistant to change. And the idea is this Agile Manifesto emerged and served as a foundation for Agile and Scrum and Kanban and many, many things over the years. And some of you may be seeing this for the first time, and some of you may say, yep, I've seen this for the last 20 years. But in light of the idea of different lenses that folks come to these concepts with, think about words in here like interactions, right? So in the Agile Manifesto, they talk about valuing individuals and interactions. So if you're a technologist, your interactions might be, oh, I'm doing some pair programming, I'm doing some debugging, I'm doing some code reviews, right? If you're coming more from an Agile space, you're the technical Agilist, you may be thinking more about how my folks are going to collaborate and understand the business logic, or how are they going to decide, what's the best pace for them to work at? What's the way in which we should do story point estimating and weighting, right? So again, the idea of the word interactions is going to be viewed in different ways. When you talk about collaboration with a customer, are we talking about uncovering requirements with them and going through that, what the functionality is? Are we talking with them about building trust over time and understanding the mission of the business, right? And the vision that the business has for themselves. Responding to change over following a plan, are the Agile technologists looking at change of code, right? We're going to have to move from one framework to another. Are the technical Agilists looking at the team dynamics is going to change, the business is going to change, the industry is going to change, and working from there. So again, the lens that you have and the tools that you have to respond to things are probably going to shade the way that you respond to something like the Agile Manifesto. Something like sprint planning, right? So within a Scrum event like sprint planning, if you're a technical Agilist, you're probably focused more on the team gathering together and pulling in the appropriate amount of work, making sure that they've got an understanding of what the definition of done is, and hearing the conversations in the sprint planning about the way in which those folks are going to go about their work, building the increment from a technical perspective, appreciating them talking about unit tests and frameworks and dependency injection and those sort of things, and incorporating that into your understanding of how successful a team is at doing their sprint planning. If you are an Agile technologist, your first response in a sprint planning might be thinking about those unit tests and how you're going to code these things, and what scope your variables are going to be, and what's going to be data driven, and what's going to be done through configuration, and keeping in the back of your mind, okay, I've kind of got to do this in the scope of the user story and the definition of done that we have formed. So that may inform the way that you respond and carry out the sprint planning. Within the sprint retrospective, when folks are examining how the sprint went, opportunities for individual improvement and team improvement, the technologist, an Agile Technologist is probably talking about, yeah, I wish we could get those unit tests to run a little faster, or I wish we could get some more feedback from something like Sonar Cloud or something like that. Keeping in mind that, yes, I understand that the benefit of those things is to improve the team overall, but they're, again, listening to it from a technical perspective. The flip side, again, if you're a technical agilist, you're probably watching in the sprint retrospective to see, is somebody speaking, and kind of dominating the conversation? Are there folks who are not getting their, an opportunity to talk and address issues? Are you seeing some body language in the meeting? Hopefully you've got your cameras on during a sprint retro, but are you seeing some body language that is indicating that some of the things people are saying is not sitting well with others? Does it feel like maybe the conversation isn't as honest as you feel it could be, given the trust that we're trying to build within the team? At the same time, your technology hat is helping you understand, yeah, those guys are frustrated and they're really having difficulty, breaking through some impediments that they have working with a particular technology or something like that. And I can appreciate their frustration with that. So again, working with each of these concepts from your lens and from your tool set is different. And then working through your days in the sprint, when you sit down, and if you're a technical agilist, you're probably working more on balancing the work and making sure that the backlog is proper, the product backlog is properly ordered. If you're coming from the technical side, you're probably sitting there coding, but you're doing it under the concept of, I'm advancing the work of the sprint. I'm building the increment. It ties to the sprint goal. I've got all these aspects that I'm keeping in mind as I'm working through all the difficulties of, why isn't this variable working? It's the value is resetting here halfway through the function. I don't know what's going on there. And then when you wrap up the day, what do you feel really good about, right? So a technical agilist probably feels good about the success of the team. We had a really good collaboration session there, or there was an impediment and a couple of the folks on the team jumped in to help, so it turned into a nice, swarming activity to keep things moving. If you're an Agile Technologist, you may be sitting back and saying, wow, that algorithm was really tough and I got through it, and it turns out it works, and it turns out it's also going to help in other areas of the application as well. Not saying, again, one of those is better than the other. It's just, what do you feel the most rewarded from in working through that aspects of the day and when you're working through sprint? Another aspect of Agile that may have two different perspectives is a working agreement. So working agreement between a team is very important for folks to have an understanding and set expectations of, here's how we're going to treat each other. Here's how we're going to collaborate. Here's how we're going to have some common language and verbiage, right? So again, what do they encompass? Are you talking about working agreements that have things about code quality and code smells and a reduction in bugs? Or is your working agreement about how you're going to interact with each other? When you have conversations, are you going to go so far as to have a talking stick and then you pass that around the room? Or are you going to have a joke of the day that everybody, the last person who goes on the daily Scrum has to bring a joke to the day or something like that? These sorts of understandings are, again, part of the team's dynamic and keeping the team successful and accountable to each other, but there's different aspects of what they mean specifically. How do you contribute to the formation? Are you going to be the person who more contributes the technical side, or the Agile and the dynamics of the team? And as an individual, what do you find most valuable? You know, do you sit back and say, yeah, I'm really glad our working agreement covers this aspect of technology because then we're all going to be on the same page of that? Or do you think about the working agreement in how we're going to, you know, always be on time for a meeting, or always be, you know, putting enough information into a user story or a task or a bug so that somebody else doesn't have to struggle with figuring out what does this thing really mean? So again, which of those do you internalize, and which is the most valuable to you? Another aspect of Agile, right, is technical debt. How is technical debt viewed through these different lenses? If you're somebody who's very comfortable with technology, you may be understanding the concept of technical debt from an Agile perspective, but be more comfortable with the way in which it's accumulated, or the way in which it is managed and reduced over time, and valued against the other things that the team is trying to produce during the sprint. If you're, again, more of a technical agilist, you may be looking at the risk that this poses to the team and their potential shift in focus of moving away from the expectations of, you know, what are we really going to deliver in this sprint, and they're getting too much into the weeds of, yeah, this isn't really debt, or this is, you know, something we can cover later, and not really not really feeling the weight of what this thing would impact them in the future, right? And then how do you respond to technical debt? Again, the Agilists, the Agile Technologist versus the technical Agilist, they're going to have a different way that they do that. And you're going to have different comfort levels, right? If you're very familiar with technology, you may be more comfortable with certain technical debt that someone who's not might not be as comfortable with. This may also affect your approach to problem solving, right? When you're going to take on something new, what do you gravitate towards? Are you somebody who gravitates towards the technical challenge, or are you somebody who gravitates towards, you know, how is this going to fit into the big picture? How is this going to advance the product? How best build the increment in the sprint, right? What do you look at for your default tools? Do you like to live in Visual Studio? Do you like to live with sticky notes on the wall, or somewhere in between, right? And then how do you collaborate with others with a similar tool set? Do you find yourself wanting to kind of pair up with folks that are more on the technical side, and then you sort of drill into things together? Or are you somebody who wants to collaborate with somebody cross purposes? So if you're a technical agilist, do you want to seek out an agile technologist and sort of come at this thing from both directions at the same time? That's a different dynamic than if you are pairing up two agile technologists or two technical agilists, right? How do you respond to change, right? Are you comfortable with change? As a technical agilist, sorry, Agile Technologist, I'm comfortable with change on the technical side. So if we had to make a change to a product that involves moving from one framework to another, then I might be okay with that. I might say, yeah, I can grasp this thing. I know that migrating the code is going to be a little bit of a challenge, but there's tools out there, and there's places like Stack Overflow I can go to get some answers, right? So I'm okay with the change to a process, change in technology, versus somebody who is a technical agilist who might be more comfortable with change in the process side, and kind of being able to evaluate, okay, if we move from a 4-week sprint to a 2-week sprint, or you know, we adopt these new practices that we've identified in the retrospective, you know, how are we going to be able to know whether those are successful, and, you know, whether they're good for the team, whether they're good for us? So again, the type of change coupled with your own tolerance for it is going to affect how you respond to that change when it comes up. So again, more of the areas that are technical versus more on the agile side. Ambiguity and risk. This is a tough one, right? Because everybody has a different tolerance for ambiguity. We know there's ambiguity in our projects. We move forward anyway with them. We have a tolerance for a certain degree of this, but again, what is your tolerance based on your default tool set, right? Are you more comfortable with ambiguity in the technology and the implementation and the way things are going to be written? Or are you more comfortable with something that's very specific? And it's like, well, we really need to know, how we're going to be naming our variables or some aspect like that. Ambiguity on the business side and the business logic. The industry is changing. The world is changing. We've got things coming out like pandemics that are changing the nature of work. People going into lockdown, they're working differently. There's an ambiguity there, right? So again, the difference between a technical ambiguity and ambiguity in the business side, coupled with your own individual tolerance, can sort of inform how you're going to respond to that. Just like understanding what is your tolerance for risk, right? So if you are willing to undertake maybe a new technology because you're comfortable with it, you might understand the technology side quite a bit and say, yeah, if we move to this unproven or untested, we haven't really had the time to vet it, identity provider for our logins, can we discern enough information by research and a spike story and a quick POC to say that overall it's going to be an acceptable risk to move to this and make this identity provider software part of our project, right? If you're very comfortable on the technical side, you may be able to assess that risk a little bit more effectively. If you're a technical agilist, your risk may be around the business side and the way the industry is going and adopting new standards and maybe changing in a team dynamics, right? Because when new folks join a team, they leave a team, the velocity of the team changes, the team dynamics changes, and that's a risk as well. So again, where are you observing these things happening? And your tool set and your lens is going to inform you of these things. And that goes hand in hand with this idea of, the difference between complex and complicated is based on is more known than unknown. And as the amount of information that is unknown decreases and the amount of information that is known increases, right, that changes the amount of risk. So do you have your known versus unknown in the technical implementation of things, or do you have it more on the business might be changing? There might be a merger and acquisition in the future, right? The industry is pivoting. Again, going back to the example of a pandemic and a lockdown, that's going to have effects, potential effects as well. And again, it's not just your own individual processing and understanding and response to ambiguity and risk that you encounter. It's with your teammates as well. So if you are in a mixed team where you are having to work with folks, obviously, that are on the opposite side of you, you're going to want to understand a little bit more how they are viewing the ambiguity and risk, how they're internalizing it, how they're processing it, and how they're formulating their response to that risk. Another aspect to look at is, what do you find rewarding as an individual? When you're wrapping up at the end of the day, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, what do you find most rewarding? Do you sit back and say, that's really cool technical problem. I finally got those services integrated with each other because I was able to solve the problem with the certificate or the mismatch on the, the function parameters or something like that. And yeah, we had a cool talk today. The retro went pretty good, but this thing really shined in the technical side, right? Versus, somebody who's maybe a technical agilist who's going to say, I'm really proud of my team. My team worked through something, they worked through an impediment, they worked through some difficulties with a team member that was affecting their dynamic, and that was awesome. I felt great. Yeah, they solved a cool technical thing, but boy, seeing the looks on everybody's faces when they came out of this meeting and they were, very thankful that they were able to do the hard work of growing as a team themselves. That to me was very rewarding. So again, what do you find most rewarding? And beyond rewarding, right, what can you appreciate? I can appreciate the depth to which that team had to deal with the technical problems that they encountered. There's a lot of complexity there. There's a lot of opportunity for things to get mismatched. There are version differences. there are, known bugs in various releases that the frameworks they're working on. I can appreciate the challenge that they're experiencing with that. And from the other side, an Agile technologist can appreciate the dynamic of the team, and everybody sort of coming together and solving their own problems, and just having a good vibe overall in the team. Can definitely appreciate that. So given all this backstory of how folks come to these different lenses that they have to view the world, and these different tool sets that they have to view the world, think about your own journey. This is probably going to carry us through the rest of the presentation today, but think about your own journey. How did you come to the aspect of being a technical agilist or an agile technologist? Did you come out of a space where you did a lot of coding and a lot of really heavy technical things? Or did you come out of more of the people side, right? What is your comfort area? What do you sort of default to? Are you more comfortable having the technical conversations? Are you more comfortable having the people conversations? What do you fall back to when facing challenges? So this is kind of important, right? Because a lot of folks who are both really sharp in the agile space and really sharp in the technical space can employ those skills and sort of swap those lenses in and out as needed. But there are times when, things get really rough. The going gets rough, right? You got deadlines. You've got, somebody on the team who is not being the team player, right? You have these expectations from the outside world, and folks tend to fall back on these initial tool sets and lenses that they first came to the arena with. So you may need to sort of think about, how are you responding to this situation? Should I be responding to this with my agile lens? Should I be responding to this with my technical lens, and the tool sets that go along with that? And realize that your sort of default, what you fall back to, may not be the best one, but you just go there because you're most familiar with it. Same thing with your lens, right? So in growing yourself as a technical agilist or as an agile technologist, these are things that you're going to want to focus on. Bring up that skill that you're not the most comfortable with. Lead your team, right? Spend some time maybe running the sprint retrospective and coordinating it, and sort of understanding what the dynamics are of the folks on the team, recognizing when people look stressed on the calls. From the other side, maybe get in and do some coding. Maybe do some unit testing, right? Maybe work on integration of frameworks or something like that, and kind of growing that. And I think that would really highly contribute to the journey that you would be on and find it more rewarding. I'm going to throw a parallel in here to not just your own journey, but how you're going to relate to other folks, right? So this is a book that's been very helpful to me over the last couple of years. I got divorced many years ago, and then when I was kind of getting out in the dating world again, somebody gave me this book, and it was great because it helped me understand not just what I perceive as behavior that comes from other folks that are in a loving way, right? Whether it's words of affirmation or physical touch. It helped me understand what other people are looking to receive. And if you're not familiar with this book, it basically says that individuals have ways in which they feel loved that are different from each other. One person might want to hear words of affirmation, so positive talk. Somebody may feel more loved when they have physical touch in a relationship. And understanding your own love language can help you advise folks to say, hey, when you spend quality time with me, I feel loved. I don't want gifts, right? I don't want necessarily a lot of praise, but quality time is the one for me. There's a big aspect of the book of understanding on the other side of the equation what the person that you're in the relationship with feels. So if your love language is words of affirmation, but the other person is not, your default tool set might be to lavish praise on this person, to talk kindly to them, and be a cheerleader for them. But if their love language is physical touch, they may come back to you and say, you know, I love these kind of terms of endearment, but what I really want is just to be close. So I'm using this as a parallel here, because if you are an Agile technologist versus a technical Agilist, it can really help understanding aspects of that journey that the other person has gone through and why they're at the place that they are, right? You can relate to them even though they have a different mindset and a different lens. Going back to the example of George and Mary, right? If they're working on coaching these kids, and you know, George's response is take a break and give them some food, and Mary's response is, well, we just need to drill more and they need to focus, you know, and do some more practice. Those aren't necessarily both wrong. And the ability of George and Mary to sort of look each other and understand, I see why you're seeing that is, you know, a potential need of the kid. Let's get some food in them, you know, and Mary looking at George and saying, yeah, I can sort of see where you would think that that's a knowledge in their skills that we need to plug with more drills and more education and things like that. Really helps them coordinate and be a better overall coaching team for the kids. So again, understanding their lenses, understanding how they interpret their surroundings and their situations, understanding these behaviors and why they're applying their particular default tool set to these situations. If you're an Agile coach, this is going to be valuable, I hope, because you can recognize the lenses and the tool sets of the people you coach, whether you're doing it on an individual basis or you're doing some team coaching, right? You may help those folks sort of get in each other's shoes and understand the way they respond and react to things that come up throughout the day, what they are getting rewarded by, what they feel most rewarded by and satisfied by in their day-to-day jobs. And then helping people, again, see each other's lenses and say, oh, I see why you see it that way, and really pulling that together. So my hope for your key takeaways from this session is know thyself, but also go easy on yourself, right? Don't beat yourself up for thinking the wrong way about something, of saying, oh, my response to this was a technical response and it should have been more on the Agile side first. There's no wrong response. It's important to recognize them all. You know, you are who you are. You know, observe this about yourself, take a note of it, and if you desire, you know, get better and strengthen that muscle, if you will, being able to respond or being able to view with a different lens and being able to respond with a different set of tools. It's also important to realize, of course, lenses and tool sets are not immutable. So if you are growing your skills, you haven't peaked. There's always some room for improvement. There's always room to, you know, expand the way that you look at things. You know, get out and talk to people, work on projects together, go to networking events, go to conferences, you know, read blog posts of Agile experts and technology experts and try to understand, okay, they're coming at this problem that they are solving, that they're writing about, and this is probably their lens set and probably their tool set. And it gives you a good opportunity to grow in it yourself. Understanding the lenses and tool sets of those around you that you work with, tremendously valuable. And communication and trust are key, right? You've got to trust when you're talking to somebody that they are sharing with you that their perceptions and their tool set and their lens is the real thing. And you should behave that way yourself. No need to hide that, hey, guess what? I'm more comfortable on the technical side. This is just how I approach things. It's not wrong or right. It's just who you are. The last thing I'm going to leave you with is don't neglect your default tool set and lens. So I know for me as a technology, as an Agile technologist, coming from the coding side, coming from working with development tools, database tools and that sort of thing, I've been growing my Scrum chops like crazy over the last couple of years, but I've also paid a little bit of attention to the technical side. So learning a new framework here. There's always the JavaScript framework of the week, right? So making sure that I'm staying on top of patterns and practices and the changing in the industry. and viewing the world with a lens that is formed and adjusted, because it's not immutable, over learnings in the industry, as it comes over time. So hopefully these takeaways will kind of help you understand yourself, shape the way that you approach things, whether you're an Agile Technologist or a technical Agilist, help sort of cross communication between those two archetypes, and give you some inspiration for growing your skills in the future. And with that, I've come to the end of the slides. Welcome any feedback, conversations, questions that any folks might have.
Awesome. Thank you, Glenn. Don't have any questions pending yet, but if anybody follows up after the fact, I'll definitely forward them on to you. Yeah, I want to thank everybody who did tune in for attending Improving's Virtual Lunch and Learn. The recording of this session will be available usually next business day, so probably by Monday, on our virtual events page at improving.com/virtual-events. And with that said, we at Improving hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks again for tuning in.
Thank you.